working with a thesis on Tom Stoppard, but they're both also at Verona. He's currently enrolled as a visiting research student at the University of Sheffield. His PhD research deals with political theatre in the 1970s and 80s, focusing on David Edgar, Carol Churchill, Howard Barker, and the company Cast, and its founder, Ronald Muldoon. His paper today is called The Reluctant Anarchist, Wage Labour, Capital and Time in Tom Stoppard's Albert Bridge, and if you're glad on you, Frank.
I apologize for my English, because really I'm not mother language, so you can understand. So, if I mispronounce something, I hope you can understand it anyway. So, labor power, therefore, is a commodity, neither more nor less than sugar. The former is measured by the clock, the latter by the scale. I choose this Marx quotation as an epigraph because I think it summarizes the relationship between time and work I'm going to explore in two of Tom Stoppard's radio plays, If You're Glad, I'll Be Frank, and Albert's Bridge. My paper aims at examining them from a political angle that is suggested by the text, but somehow contradicts the playwright's political views. Tom Stoppard's relationship with politics have been uneasy for long, or, according to some critics, difficult to define. The wit and verbal dexterity that are the trademark of the bounced check Tom seem to exclude or not to necessitate any social or political involvement. Of course, this makes sense only if you consider politics just as left-wing or socialist politics. In fact, quite a few of Stoppard's plays for the 70s and 80s have strong political undertones. Some of them can be considered just to respond to the author's preoccupation with human rights in the former Soviet Empire, such as Every Good Boy Deserves Favor and the TV play Professional Foul, both 1977. But other plays show a quite explicit will to intervene in the British and international political discourse. I refer to Jumpers, 1972, and Night and Day, 1978. In the latter, the issue of free journalism is dealt with in a way that anticipates Thatcher attitude, not to mention Murdoch-Thatcher's pact and the Wapping dispute. For those too young to remember, the Wapping dispute was a long strike by the print workers whose failure marked the final act of Thatcher's victory over the trade unions, or, to put it another way, drove the final nail in the trade unions' coffin. The play, anyway, Night and Day, takes place in Africa, and apart from the subject of the press, it touches on the issue of decolonization. One of the characters is an African dictator that, beneath its British politeness, hides a violent and murderous nature. Probably Stoppard had Idi Amin in mind, yet the portrayal of an African chief of state as a polished cannibal was, and still is, deeply disturbing, especially considering that in those years the struggle in South Africa was coming into the international spotlight with the Soweto uprising of 1976 and the killing of Biko in 1977. Even more politically oriented is Jumpers, in which the audience is encouraged to identify the fictional radical Liberal Party, seizing power with fake elections, with the Labour Party, with, quote, the cues like this, I quote, "You remember how they rationalized the railways? Well, now they're going to rationalize the church," unquote. In my MA thesis, I do a comparison between Jumpers and Noel Coward's Peace in Our Time, in that in both plays, British people lose their freedom out of complacency and laziness. We can simply assume that Stoppard is, or at least was, a conservative through and through, a conservative with a capital C, paraphrasing a famous self-definition by Stoppard himself. A further proof is necessary of his political leaning is that in the 80s he was a member of the Committee for the Free World, a right-wing think tank connected to the Reagan administration. Yet, the other plays I'm going to deal with offer a somehow different political perspective and may be subjected to an admittedly daring socialist reading. These two radio plays belong to an early period of Stoppard's career. They were broadcasted by BBC in the late 60s, If You're Glad in February 1966, and Albert's Bridge in July 1967. Those were decisive years for Tom Stoppard, as in August 1966, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern was presented at the Edinburgh Festival, and the following April opened at the Old Vic. In 1966 was also published, and mostly ignored by public and critic alike, Stoppard's one and only novel so far, Lord Marquis and Mr. Moon. It was probably after this failure that Stoppard decided that its future was definitely in the theatre. Those were momentous years for the world at large, leading to the watershed of 1968. In 1966, Chairman Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, whose relevance will probably escape most of the present, but was a teenager revolutionary in the 70s, was the squaring of a circle between Soviet bureaucracy and people control. So it was quite important. In 1967, Ernesto Che Guevara was murdered in Bolivia, while in the United States, in those years, opposition grew to the Vietnam War. As for pop culture, 1967 was the year Beatles' Sgt. Pepper was released, and the USA Monterey Festival of the sort of dress rehearsal of a better known Woodstock Festival of the following year. Well, as for social mobility, I have to mention also that in 1967, Celtic Glasgow won the European Cup, defeating the superpowers of European football. So, but I do not think that these radio plays were the result of exposure to the zeitgeist. In fact, we know precisely the genesis of If You're Glad, since Stoppard explains it in the introduction to the collection of his radio plays. I quote, "If You're Glad came of a conversation in a corridor at Portland Place. Richard Imison, who at the time was script editor for BBC Radio Drama, pounced on me tiger-like with news of series of short plays about people in imaginary jobs. There and then, I proposed the speaking clock. I named her Gladys and gave her a propensity towards interior monologue in 3 verses, so she went out on the 3rd. Unquote. It was therefore a commissioned work, that is, writing a play about an imaginary job. The fact that BBC had broadcasted in 1963 Stoppard's TV play, A Walk on the Water, about an eccentric inventor may have influenced the BBC editor in choosing Stoppard as the right person to write a play about absurd people doing absurd jobs. In If You're Glad, the female protagonist, Gladys, takes on the job as the voice of a speaking clock after unsuccessfully attempting to be accepted as a nun in a convent. Quote, "It was the serenity I was after, that and the clean linen," unquote. And now she's trapped into a job that at first she entered on her own free will. The drama unfolds from the first scene in which her husband, Frank, who is still in love with her, dials the speaking clock and recognizes her voice, deciding on the spot to claim her back. He is a bus driver, and so he has to run ahead of schedule in order to have a few minutes to find his way into the central post office and reach her or find her whereabouts. Meanwhile, Gladys expresses her thoughts with an interior monologue, mostly in 3 verses, with a distinct Eliotian taste, and a sprinkle of Cole Porter too. I quote, "Because they think that time is something they invented for their own convenience and divide it up into ticks and tocks and 60s and 12s and 24s, so that they know when the Olympic record has been broken and when to stop serving dinner in second-class hotels, when the season opens and the betting closes, when to retire, when to leave the station, renew their application when their subscription has expired, when time has run out." Unquote. Every speech is counterpointed by the speaking clock, which is supposed to be true to the passing of time in broadcasting. Stoppard's directions are precise in this matter. I quote, where her team voice intrudes again, I have indicated this not but the actual words she uses, because the actual time she announces should be related to the number of minutes and seconds that have passed." Unquote. So we have 3 tempos: the objective time of a team voice, the frenetic activity of Frank in his escapades from his bus routes, and the apparently slow-down reasoning of Gladys. Catherine Kelly sums up the situation. Quote, "Frank's bus schedule obligates him to catch up with the minutes and seconds just as literally as Gladys' position ties her to counting them. Thus, when Frank dominates the scene, the tempo is driven frenetically by the passing of clock time, whereas when Gladys' voice speaks, we hear a reflective meditation on eternity, ironically foregrounded by her announcing of minutes and seconds. Time appears to speed up with Frank and to slow down with Gladys." Unquote. At the end, Frank and Gladys do not meet, as both are tricked by the first lord of the post office by means of dialectics. Frank is persuaded that there is no Gladys and that the speaking clock is a machine. In the meanwhile, Gladys is cracking under the strain of her task. Quote, "At the first stroke, I'm going to give it up. Yes, it's asking too much. For one person to be in the know of so much, for so many." When she starts sobbing and crying in her speaking clock role, she is brought under control by the first lord of the post office with a paternalistic appeal to her sense of responsibility. "Mrs. Jenkins, pull yourself together, stop crying. And you've lost 40 seconds somewhere by my watch. Come on now, this isn't like you at all. Let's get things back on the rail. Think of the public, Mrs. Jenkins," unquote. Gladys' crisis brings to mind the images of other workers who cracks under the weight of work. One is obviously Charlie Chaplin in Modern Time. Another one is Metropolis, the worker in the clock-like device. Compared with the image of class pacification, presented by the final scene of the Langs movie, Metropolis, If You're Glad may be read in a Marxist perspective as a denunciation of exploitation and gullibility of the workers who have not built their class consciousness. As Karl Marx ironically remarked in Wage, Labor and Capital, quote, "The interests of the capitalist and those of the worker are therefore one and the same, assert the bourgeois and their economists. Indeed." This issue was also dealt with by Dario Fo, who, in his The Boss Knows 1,000 words, the workers knows 300 words, the boss knows 1,000, that's why he's the boss, highlights the importance of education for the working class. Moreover, Gladys' not entirely voluntary stay inside the post office may be read as an effective metaphor of the condition of the working class, whose freedom of leaving a job is, according to Marx, illusory. I quote, "The worker leaves the capitalist to whom he hires himself wherever he likes, but the worker cannot leave the whole capitalistic class without renouncing his existence," unquote. And so, always in Marxist terms, some hope is offered by Frank, who, trying to be ahead of schedule in order to have a few minutes to devote to the rescue of his Gladys, in effect repossesses some of his surplus value, not in money, but in time. A revolutionary activity, albeit individual and on a small scale, and not collective. Marxist analysis apart, Gladys is one of a long series of individuals in Stoppard's work who reject the rules of social living and retire from the world. The author's sympathy is clearly with them, since they put into practice Lord Marquist's motto. Lord Marquist is the protagonist of Stoppard's only novel. Since we cannot hope for order, let us withdraw with style from the chaos. As Kenneth Tynan remarked, quote, "Fuchs Stoppard would doubtless deny it, this pronouncement of Marquist have a ring of authority which suggests the author speaking," unquote. Albert, the eponymous protagonist of Aldous Bridge, is another one of this conscience objector to the rules of social living that Stoppard puts at the center of his plays. Albert is an educated man with a rich family and a degree in philosophy, but maybe he is not bright enough for an academic career. Quote, "I wanted to stay on after my degree, but they wouldn't have me," unquote. Therefore, he chooses to work painting a bridge that requires continuous repainting. I think that this way of saying to paint the first bridge is idiomatic in English, means doing something on and on and on from the start. So his withdrawal from the world reminds of that of Gladys, but what Albert seeks, differently from Gladys, is not so much serenity, but, as he puts it, the perspective he gets from looking down from the bridge. "I saw the context. It reduced philosophy and everything else. I got a perspective. Oppositely to Gladys, the enormous scale of the task is what attracts him. Quote, I was happiest there, doing something simple but so grand, without end. Unquote. Albert is a sort of alter ego, Fraser, another dropout, an aspirant suicide who climbs the bridge several times, but always changes his mind when he sees the world from above. Quote, yes, from a vantage point like this, the idea of society is just about attainable. Unquote. The tragic, mock tragic ending of the play is brought on by the decision to employ just one painter, that is Albert, instead of 4, using a paint that lasts 4 times as long. When the parts of the bridge who have not yet been reached by the new paint rapidly deteriorate, the City Council decides to employ 1,800 painters in one go to finish the job in a single day, and the bridge collapses under their weight. The city engineer, who is in charge of the maintenance of the bridge, as is instrumental in implementing the new course of works, translates into high-flown words and far-fetched ideas the simple will or need to save money. Quote, efficiency isn't a matter of good or bad entirely. It's a matter of the optimum use of resources, time, money, manpower. It's poetry to me, a perfect equation of space, time, and energy. It's continuity, control, mathematics. A Marxist polemist or satirist could not have done better in disclosing and ridiculing the nature of superstructure and its relationship to the underlying economic basis. The very idea that applying the principles of Taylorism, that is, that any work can be divided into smaller parts to be executed by unskilled workers, to public utilities may have disastrous consequences, is as far as can be from a conservative approach that traditionally goes in the direction of cost and tax cutting. A view surprisingly akin to that expression by Ken Loach in his The Navigators, in which an efficient team of railway workers is disbanded, resulting in a less efficient work and in the death of one of them for lack of security measures. As a conclusion, am I seriously suggesting that Tom Stoppard is a crypto-communist, using Orwell's famous phrasing? Well, no, certainly not. And that is why I title my paper The Reluctant Anarchist and not The Reluctant Marxist. A certain affinity of Tom Stoppard with anarchism could be argued for, of course, in its more individualistic variant. Incidentally, Mikhail Bakunin, a founding father of anarchism, is a character in Stoppard's Coast of Utopia, not an entirely sympathetic one for the matter. Anyway, it comes as no surprise that in Tom Stoppard's work there is a gathering of individuals who rebel against oppressive institutions for the sake of personal freedom. Just to mention 2 of them, Alexander Ivanov, of Every Good Boy Deserves Favor, and Milne, the freelance journalist who clashes with his union in Night and Day. As for a possible socialist reading, Stoppard himself declared not to be always aware of every possible meaning or implication of what he writes. Quote, the thing is, if my plays were the end product of my ideas, they'd have it all more pat. But a lot of time, I end up trying to work out the ultimate implication of what I have written. My plays are a lot to do with the fact that I just don't know. Unquote. I do not think that this is always the case, since, as stated above, in some of Stoppard's plays, like Jumpers, it looks like if there was a logic at work in Guildenstern words. That is the look designed in order to obtain a political effect. Yet, I can safely conclude that time, probably the most powerful cage imprisoning human being, brings out the most libertarian side of Tom Stoppard. In its being the unity of measurement of work, it also forces him to face some concrete aspects of a life of working class, to the point of making him include, consciously or unconsciously, the most basically Marxist freedom, that is freedom from need, among other fundamental liberties, like that of speech and press. And well, just as an end, this is Bakunin. And this is Tom Stoppard, because in the 6th of July, Tom Stoppard is going to be 80. So happy birthday, Sir Tom.